I needed a replacement linear switch to go in this keyboard, but I wanted to make sure it was something I didn't need to do a whole lot of work with out of the box, because frankly, my time is a little limited right now and I have several other projects that I'm working on, so I needed something that was largely plug and play. So, to that end, we are going to be taking a look at 3 different linear mechanical switches and comparing prices and some of the different build features and qualities of these switches and see which one ended up being the best out-of-box experience. Now, as a quick disclaimer, Momoka did send their frog switches in for me to test today. So first of all, thank you Momoka for sending those in. But secondly, no, that's not going to influence my perception of these switches at all. It's still going to get the same fair shake that everything else does that comes across my table. So to that end, we'll start with the Momoka frog switch, a relative newcomer to the scene. This vibrant green linear rocks a 62-gram spring, polycarbonate top housing, nylon 66 3-pin bottom housing, and a reasonably firm leaf. It ships in a 108 pack for about $58 plus shipping, which gives you enough switches to cover up to a full-size keyboard and brings the pre-shipping cost of each switch to around 54 cents. The stem is of palm construction and has a unique skirt that covers the top of the stem. This has the unique effect of helping make sure whatever cap you place on the switch fits properly. However, depending on the thickness of the cap stem, this could impact compatibility. The stem and spring come lightly lubed from the factory using a combination of GPL 105 and 205 grade 0, and seems fairly consistent across the 3 switches sampled, with most of the lube being at the top and bottom of the spring, and on the leg of the stem with a barely there film on the side rails. The spring exhibits barely any discernible ping at all. At first, these switches felt slightly sluggish, but a few days of use saw much better smoothness across the board. In my testing on the Drop Carina, this switch unfortunately ended up sounding and feeling almost exactly like the Gateron yellows I'm replacing, which isn't a bad thing at all, since those were lubed, filmed, and broken in. In a different board, I suspect these would perform better acoustically. Also worth noting, these stems almost perfectly match the color of the frozen llama caps we're using here, so if you want to match these caps, there is no closer match I've seen yet. Applying your own 205 grade 0 and switch film causes the switch to get more character in its sound and has less sluggishness prior to break-in. Now, in a bubble, the pricing for these Momoka frogs is actually pretty reasonable, and I do plan on using this in some future content for the channel. Sound off down in the comments below, what would you use a linear switch like this for? Next up was the Everglide Aqua King, a switch I was genuinely very excited to receive due to its truly unique all polycarb construction and promise of factory lube for a remarkably smooth typing experience. However, reality reared its ugly head in ways that taught me a bit more about mechanical switches in general. Priced at $79 for a 110 count on Drop's website, plus $5 shipping for me, that brings the total cost per switch to 76 cents, the most expensive switch I have ever owned. Out of the bag, however, the experience wasn't great. Let's start with construction. The polycarbonate stem is a big problem with the switch for a number of reasons. First off, the tolerances between the top housing and the stem are so bloody tight that the stem drags against the opening in the top housing, and the housing's fitment is tight such that the bottom housing is compressed against the stem's slide rails. As such, I don't recommend using switch films on the housing as it makes the problem far worse than it already is. There's no lube in the world that can overcome this, since there's just not enough of a gap between the components for it to matter. This leads to, in my case, a 62-gram linear that feels more like a 65 to 67-gram one, and not in a good way. Speaking of lube, it was very inconsistently applied on the stem, appearing to be dip lubed, as evidenced by the hard line present on the inside of the stem legs, an area that literally does not need to be lubed at all. The second issue with the stem, polycarbonate doesn't have the best static coefficient of friction for this purpose, and doesn't really break in the same way that something like POM or UHMWPE would. materials that are far more commonly used in switch construction. This is partially compensated for with what has got to be the most fragile and light leaf I have ever experienced in a switch. So much so that when I tried to use a tactile Everglide stem in the housing, it permanently warped the leaf. That said, switching to a Gateron red stem revealed that even without applying any more lube, this stem made the switch feel downright great, and gave the sound a bit more pitch without removing that signature polycarbonate bottom-out sound. On a positive note, the spring is gold-plated, well-lubed, and has almost zero ping. Now, even though the Aqua King switch certainly has a lot of modding potential in that you could take a different known good linear stem that's made of something like POM or ultra high molecular weight polyethylene and use it to great effect here, the fact that I'm having to pay nearly 80 cents a switch out of the box for something that doesn't really feel great out of the box and requires additional work on my part means that this definitely is not a winner as a stock switch. However, like the Frog switch, I will be using at least the switch housings here in some future content because I've got some keyboards I've been sitting on for a while that I think might be a good fit for this polycarbonate switch housing. Last but certainly not least, Gateron Milky caps. Priced at an astonishingly low $12 for 35 switches. For 105 of them, the price becomes 34 cents per switch before shipping. That makes this a shockingly cost-effective switch, especially considering it's factory lubed and has a truly unique construction to it. With a 62-gram spring installed, you'd think it would feel closer to a standard yellow than it does. But there's a lot going on here that makes this switch really stand out. First of all, the spring is at least 1/3 longer than a typical Gateron spring. This creates a preloaded tension that gives the switch an overall slower and more stable compression rate. Second is the very consistently applied lube. All switches open revealed excellent coverage and application on both the stem and the spring. And once again, we have a switch with basically zero ping. However, it does have a bit of a weird break-in thing where some of the springs feel a bit crunchy at first from the lube spreading out effectively on the spring perches. If this happens to you, I have found that just using the switch over time largely breaks in and eliminates this crunchy issue. This phenomenon is, however, exacerbated by switch films, so if you decide to use them, I would recommend also re-lubing the springs to compensate. Outside of that, the switch feels remarkably and truly smooth right out of its absurdly nice box. No, really, this is some of the nicest packaging I've ever seen for a switch. How exactly are these so inexpensive again? The stem is a wild departure from traditional switch design and asks the question, why does the stem have to insert into the bottom housing when the bottom housing can insert into the stem? This design has two key features. Not only is the stem far more stable in the housing because of this design, but you have smoother actuation that's being assisted by a small hole in the top of the stem perch in the bottom housing. This prevents so-called stem farts from happening as it provides a place for excess pressure to escape, but may also allow excess lube to escape. So if you do lube these yourself, be careful here. I'm unfamiliar with what the housing is made of, but it gives this switch a unique sound that I feel helps the acoustics of the Carina quite a bit, which was the final deciding factor that led to these being the perfect replacement switch for our tried and true Gateron yellows. So there we have it. The least expensive of our switch options ended up being the replacement option for our Gateron yellow switches. This was kind of a funny result to me because it just goes to sort of further illustrate that just because something is inherently more expensive, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a better option for you. The Everglide Aqua King is a perfect example of that. Yes, it can be made to be an awesome switch if you do some modifications and swap out parts here and there, but that just absolutely obliterates the value prospect there. And something like a Gateron Milky cap switch here, it just provides you with too much value as a linear switch for me to not recommend this over most of the other linear switch options out there. It's inherently very stable out of the box. It has great spring compression to it, amazing smoothness, and especially in the case of pairing it with a Carina, the Milky housing matching the Milky frosted exterior of the Carina makes for some really cleanly diffused RGB lighting on this keyboard. I am super happy with this switch. And I'm hoping this inspires all of you to sort of give different switch options a chance out there, regardless of what the price may be. You may be surprised what you end up liking. Speaking of liking, if you ended up liking what you see here, make sure you toss the video a thumbs up on your way out, and make sure you're subscribed and notified so you don't miss any of our content when it goes live. And I'll catch you all next time. Take it easy.